Clustering overview. So what is clustering? Well, this is where we have no class labels. This is unsupervised learning. So as opposed to classification, which was supervised, and we had some kind of class label that we were trying to predict or categorize new data to, we don't have that in clustering. We're just trying to group similar objects together. So we don't have a label for them, but we might have something like age versus income on a plot, and we're just looking for groups that are similar in age and income. So a clustering model then can be used on new data to determine where they fall. So based on their age and the income, we can group them into a similar bucket, similar cluster. So lots of examples of clustering. This is an example from 15-year-old on Facebook, their connections and what their connection is. There's some details. Someone mined out their details of how they are connected. Kind of a graph based. Clustering as far as things for sale, you can see on a map, and it can be quite extensive. So one thing that's nice with clustering is, well, there's a lot of data points, and so clustering them into groups, so it's a little bit easier to read and see on the map is another thing, and that's location-based or spatial. So another example, whether it's Pizza Hut, FedEx, UPS, or any kind of delivery type system, let's say we had a bunch of places that we wanted to deliver. So the flags are just different locations, and we need to figure out how many we're going to end up delivering, like how we're going to approach it. So if we have 3 drivers, for example, who's going to cover which areas? And so what we can do, one algorithm for this, is to set up 3 cluster centers. So we randomly just select 3 centers, and by random, you can use some domain knowledge and try to come up with something slightly more efficient, but essentially random. You're not really overthinking where to place these 3. And then what we can do is then assign each location, each of these flags, to the closest cluster center. And so using our distance formulas, like Euclidean, Minkowski, etc., we'll calculate who each one of these belong to. So find the distance, find the shortest distance for each one. And then we can classify those as that particular cluster. So now C1 is all the green flags, C2 is the blue ones, C3 are the orange ones. So now the next point would be to recalculate the center based on who's in that cluster. So we want to calculate the average of putting the centroid object here in the middle of that group, at that cluster. So once we do that, we're going to then reassign all the objects. So we're going to look for the distance. What's the shortest distance to a center for each one of these objects? And then we have our clusters. And you can continue through until no one gets assigned to a new cluster. All right, so that's an example of something like K-means algorithm for clustering. So the basic concepts, we're going to look through partitioning methods like K-means. We'll look at K-medoids, hierarchical methods, and density-based, grid-based, and evaluation. So the basic concepts, we have these clusters, and it's a collection of data objects that are similar to each other. There's no predefined classes or class labels. So we're just looking for similarity based on some kind of distance function that we're using. So for the cluster analysis, we want to assign objects to a cluster, one that they're most similar to, which is usually based on this distance formula. So the ones that are within a cluster, we want to have high similarity. And between clusters, we want to have less similarity. We want to maximize the distance between them. So we want to group similar objects and be able to differentiate between clusters based on maximizing the distance between clusters. So high quality clusters, we're looking for 2 things: intra-class similarity and the inter-class similarity. So we want high intra cluster similarity, so cohesive within a particular cluster. And then we want low interclass similarity. So we don't want the classes, these clusters, to be close together. We want them to be as far apart as we can. So the quality is going to really depend on the similarity measure that we use, so what distance function, how we implement this, and are we able to discover some or all of those hidden patterns that we are looking for in there. So the distance function, so we want to determine the similarity based on Euclidean. If we're doing a direct path, which was like the plane distance, we could use Manhattan distance, like the city block distance. Cosine, which is the normalized dot product of two attributes, which is really good for sparse vectors. Or Minkowski, which is kind of a generalization of Euclidean and Manhattan. Weights should be associated with different variables based on the application and your data semantics. It's really hard, though, to define similar enough or good enough. Typically, this can be very highly subjective. So again, the more domain knowledge you have or working with the domain expert can be very helpful in this situation. So our partitioning criteria, we can look at single level or hierarchical, multi-level hierarchical partitioning. We can look at separation of clusters, the exclusive or non-exclusive. So in this example, these two clusters are separate from each other. In the second diagram here, we've got these blue ones that are overlapping in both clusters. So whether it's exclusive, where a customer can only belong to one region, for example, or non-exclusive, where a document can belong to more than one classification. So for a document, that can make sense because it could be about video games, which is also about software, which is also about entertainment. So you might have it non-exclusive where it can belong to multiple clusters. So our similarity measures, we're looking at the distance formulas. We can also look at connectivity based, so the density within it or contiguity. And the clustering space, so it's usually a full space when we've got these in low dimension, but when we're in the subspace, in the high dimensional clustering, we talk about subspaces and looking for patterns in these subspaces. And high dimensional is always difficult. A good area of research. So some of the requirements for clustering, for scalability, we want to be able to cluster all the data instead of only on samples. So we want to be able to scale. Data analytics, millions is even small for data sets these days. So you could have billions or trillions in your data set. And can you handle that for your clustering? For different types of attributes, we've got numerical, we got binary, categorical, ordinal, linked, and a mixture of these. And so being able to deal with that. So when you go through the various clustering algorithms, determining which types it can work with or how you work with multiple types. Clusters with arbitrary shape. So when you have this example shown here, we've got essentially 3 different clusters. So we have 2 circles on the inside, and then we have this outer circle that's going around the 2 balls. So that's really odd for some algorithms, and some algorithms can handle that. So we'll talk about how to handle arbitrary shape, like density-based. Minimal domain knowledge for parameters. So with our knowing what to tweak in the parameters, having some domain knowledge or working with a domain expert is very helpful. Noisy data, how you handle that, or is that going to skew the data, or is it going to not affect the algorithm that you're using? Incremental, so being insensitive to input order. So for decision is not like the decision tree, and probabilistic approach is incremental. You only need to update those probabilities with new information. That was all the classification side. So we'll look at the incremental side of clustering, which works. And then high dimensional, again, high dimensional is always difficult. It's more time consuming and dealing and looking for the patterns in a high dimensional space can be hard, and it might be easier to divide it up into subspaces. Constraint-based clustering, where a user may give inputs on certain constraints using domain knowledge to determine input parameters as well. And interpretability and usability, being able to understand the process and the decisions that are made and how things got clustered together. Does it make sense? So major clustering methods, we'll start with partitioning methods, where you partition the data into X number or K number of partitions. So we usually use the word or the letter K. So K-means or K-medoids. Well, very similar algorithms. We'll talk about the difference between those two. And there are other algorithms as well on partitioning specifically. We'll look at hierarchical, where you can go top down, or you can go bottom up, where if you were bottom up, you're starting with each object in its own cluster, its own separate cluster. Then you use your distance formula to start to group them together. If you go from top down, you're starting with them all in one cluster. So your entire data set's in one cluster. And then what you're going to do is start to split them up based on their similarity distance. And so hierarchical, you don't necessarily have to define the number of clusters you're going to have up front, which is nice. You can do it based on a threshold. When you hit a certain threshold similarity, or you can stop. And so we'll look at Burke and Chameleon as examples here. And then for density-based, we can focus on just how dense it is. So certain clusters, the green one is really quite dense, versus the red cluster is less dense. So there's more distance space between the objects within the cluster. It's still defined to be within a cluster. And so that's how we can handle some of the more fancy shapes that we see when we try to cluster. So the notion of community and close to your neighbors, that you're in that particular community. And it depends on the cluster, what the density is, and how you define that. And again, domain knowledge can help. And then there's grid-based methods like Sting wave cluster. The grid idea is splitting your space. So instead of grouping objects, you're not worried about objects for now, you're just looking at the space. So you can split up age versus annual income, split the space into 21 to 30, 31 to 40 grid cells, and the income splits. And the objects in the same grid cell are considered similar, or neighboring grid cells can also be considered similar. And so when you start to group them, even if they are in different grids, if they're neighboring grids, they may even be clustered together, depending on the number of clusters you desire on your data set. So then we also have model-based methods, such as Cobweb and the maps, heat maps. So a mathematical model, what your model would look like. So assuming you have a Gaussian distribution with one-dimensional, two-dimensional, everyone in a certain neighborhood, you got your mean value and standard deviation. So Cobweb is a hierarchical clustering in the form of a classification tree. And so each node refers to a concept and contains a probabilistic description of that concept. And then our map, this is a self-organizing map, SOM, which is using a neural network approach. And clustering on high-dimensional data, we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, high-dimensional data is challenging, and we can look at the subspace clustering and how do we divide up the space to help us find patterns in the subspaces. So constraint-based clustering, we're adding constraints to specify. So here we also have our own user constraints that we may include for our clustering.